So Tera W. Hunter is a professor of history and African American studies at Princeton University. A native of Miami, Florida, and a graduate of Duke University and Yale University, her research and teaching focus on labor, gender, race, and Southern history from early America to present times. Dr. Hunter has written and edited multiple publications, and her most recent book was the 2017 award-winning Bound in Wedlock, Slave and Free Black Marriage in the 19th Century. We have copies at the desk if you'd like to purchase them when you're done today. She has also written pieces for and been featured on numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, Ebony, and National Public Radio. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Tera Hunter.
So this is the marriage certificate of my great-great-grandparents, Ellen Morrison and Moses Hunter from 1873. They were the first intra-racial couple in the family who we can say with certainty legally married. Ellen and Moses' marriage certificate is quite typical of many such documents that came out during the Reconstruction period when slaves secured their freedom, their citizenship, and a host of rights, including the right to marry. And their story encapsulates many aspects of African American marital love and struggles in the 19th century. Most of their ancestors did not have the same opportunity that they did to choose their own mates and marriage partners. Slaves were not allowed to marry legally, but they were allowed to marry informally with their master's permission. When they decided to wed, they were forced to revise the standard wedding vows to make them fit their status as chattel property. As one white minister officiating at a slave ceremony frankly reminded the couple, their marriage was only binding until death or distance do you part. A black preacher identified the persons to blame more bluntly by saying till death or bakra part you, meaning the white man. Marriage under slavery was the foundation upon which slave families were built. So we can't really fully appreciate how the enslaved endured those centuries of oppression without understanding the importance of family to them. At the same time, family was nearly always at the center of the most horrendous heartbreaks. Spouses, children, and other family members were frequently sold away or otherwise separated from one another against their will. So probably many of you here in Richmond know the story of Henry Box Brown. He actually lived here in Richmond. He was an enslaved person here, and he mailed himself in that box from Richmond to Philadelphia. And he had room enough only for his body and a few biscuits and a flask of water. And he was quite successful in reaching his destination within 27 hours. But most people don't know the story behind that escape, what motivated him to escape. It was his wife and children being sold away from him that drove him to the brink. He had done all that he could humanly do as a hired out slave to keep his family together, even paying his wife's master not to split them apart. As he walked along the side of the wagon, taking his family away, he recalled the agony in his autobiography, and I'll just quote briefly. Both our hearts were so overpowered with feeling that we could say nothing. And when at last we were obliged to part, the look of mutual love which we exchanged was all the token which we could give each other. Then we should yet meet in heaven. So this is a story of love and loss, which prompted the dramatic escape by a man desperate to get out of bondage and to tell the world about the sufferings of fellow slaves. So the Civil War became an important sort of moment of reprieve for African Americans seeking to protect their families. And it was a key turning point in the history of marriages for several reasons. So the first reason had to do, and I'm sure there's plenty of information surrounding us about exactly what I'm going to be talking about, but the first was that African Americans put themselves on the nation's agenda at the moment that the war broke out. they insisted, despite promises to the contrary, that their freedom would be a factor in the war. And they did this by running away in droves, following in the foot trails of Union Army soldiers and officers, which forced the federal government to have to contend with them. So the government quickly realized that they could not ignore this population. Officials began to set up what were called contraband camps. These were places that became magnets for runaways. First, it was mostly men who ran away, and then soon after, women started to run away in large numbers, along with children and the elderly. Northern missionaries came down to assist in these camps, running these camps, seeing this as an opportunity, one, to sort of encourage Christianity, but also as a way of starting to inculcate the values that they thought that African Americans would need once they became free people. One of the first camps that was set up was right here in Virginia, not that far away from here in Hampton Roads area at Fortress Monroe in the fall of 1861. And the missionaries there began the process of introducing legal marriage to enslaved people. They began marrying couples who had not been married before, and also started to remarry those couples who had been married according to slave tradition. Federal officials began to participate in this process of what became known as marriage under the flag. In some cases, ceremonies were officiated by Union officers, by Army chaplains, literally below flags flying above or within the vicinity of these ceremonies. And then after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, and black men were allowed to enlist in the Army, federal officials became even more interested in the married lives and families of the soldiers. Black men made it perfectly clear that they were not willing to join the military without the guarantee that their families would be protected and given their freedom. So in essence, marriage became important because it was a way to encourage enlistment, because it fit within the war aims. It was seen as a way to basically help win the war for the United States. So that was part of what was motivating the federal government's interests. Once the war was over, most African Americans were able to legalize their existing relationships or enter into their first marriages as legal spouses. And so this is the period when my great-great-grandparents decided to get married in 1873. Their first child was born in 1866, and we can talk later if you're interested about that gap. First, under the auspices of the federal government through the Freedmen's Bureau, couples began to put their marriages on legal footing. Southern states were at first reluctant to embrace granting any civil rights to former slaves, including the right to marry. Many of you may recall several years ago when we had marriage equality instituted, there was a woman who was a clerk in Kentucky who refused to give marriage certificates to gay couples. Well, this was happening in the period of Reconstruction with African Americans. Some officials just refused to give marriage certificates to African Americans, or they hiked up the licenses, so they did all kinds of things basically to try to prevent African Americans from marrying. But the states did come around, and they began to pass laws that legalized the marriages of former slaves. And so between the period of about 1866 and 1870, lots of states started to recognize these marriages for the first time. As a result of that, African Americans gained new benefits from legalizing their relationships, as well as unexpected burdens. First, for the benefits. They gained the right to protect the integrity of their relationships from outside interference, especially the marriage bed. They gained the right to love the people they wanted to love, to reject the people that they wanted to reject. Men gained rights as heads of households. Women gained rights as their dependents. Parents gained rights over their children. And they also gained the right to basically pass on inheritances to their surviving spouses and children. In terms of the unexpected burdens, they discovered that they would be disproportionately punished for not marrying legally. So those informal relationships that had been formed under slavery, that had been standard and required, were now frowned upon and penalized. States used marriage laws not just to grant a new civil right to African Americans, but also to punish them for their seeming deviance when they did not obey them. So African Americans were often prosecuted disproportionately for marital infractions like adultery, desertion, or even engaged in disputes as couples. These were often trumped-up charges used by white landowners to undermine the autonomy of former slaves. Suddenly, marriage did not look as attractive or as self-empowering when it was used as a way to discipline workers or to force them to conform to rules designed to undermine their freedom and advance the economic interests of landowners and the new sharecropping system. But despite this, African Americans overwhelmingly chose legal marriage in the decades following the Civil War. African Americans had come a long way by the beginning of the 20th century. So it is remarkable that by 1900, most African Americans of marriageable age did marry. They married at rates that were equal to, and sometimes at greater rates than whites, because they tended to marry younger than most white Americans. They also tended to remarry if their relationships ended because of divorce or death, also at higher rates than whites. This should not diminish the fact that African Americans continue to adopt a diverse array of intimate and familial forms that included informal arrangements, many moving from legal marriage to common law marriage, or the reverse, in serial relationships over the course of their lives. But the larger point should not be missed. Black people married at high rates, just decades after the end of slavery. A century later, however, those patterns would be completely reversed. By the 1990s, only a minority of African Americans were married. So what happened? How do we go from nearly universal rates of marriage to the complete reversal? The decade of the 1940s is a critical decade in thinking about the beginning of the decline in marriage rates and a growing racial gap between black and white marriage rates. And that gap has grown increasingly ever since. Not by coincidence, the vast middle class, which we once took for granted but no longer, had its origins in this period. This was the era in which the first and only major redistribution of wealth in the century occurred. As a result of technological innovations, savings from wartime wages, and the infusion of federal dollars into the economy. For the first time in U.S. history, the differences between the earnings of blue-collar and white-collar workers shrank. So the inequality that we talk about today, it was at its lowest point in this period. Some Americans benefited from this growth, and others did less so, however. White marriage rates rose after World War II, thanks in no small part to financial subsidies redistributed through what was called the GI Bill, or the Selective Service Readjustment Act of 1944. Between 1944 and 1971, the bill gave out $95 billion to millions of veterans to buy homes, to attend college, to start businesses, to find jobs, and to marry. There was a concern about what would happen to those soldiers once they came back from the war. There was a concern that they would be disorderly if they weren't. Brought back home and, sort of given the normal life treatment that one expects from a marriage. Men who married received more benefits than men who remained single, to encourage them to transition from the nearly all-male world that they had lived in the military, again, to more traditional family life. The entitlement was ostensibly race neutral. There was no racial discrimination in the law, but the federal government basically allowed local and states to dole out the money. So in the context of the Jim Crow South, that meant that black veterans often did not get the benefits that they were entitled to because those states and localities were allowed to discriminate in doling out the resources and the jobs. So while white marriages went up, black marriages declined as a result of the artificially low racial quotas that constricted employment markets, slowed entry into homeownership, and curtailed educational opportunities. And marriage rates have grown increasingly divergent by race since then. It is important to note that all marriages are strongly correlated with the health of the economy. So generally speaking, when the economy is good, marriage rates go up. When the economy is not so good, people tend not to marry as much. But the marriages of African Americans have suffered even more because they have been disproportionately at the bottom of the economy. In every decade since the 1940s, African Americans have experienced a steady growth of permanent unemployment. It's one thing to face difficulty in finding jobs during temporary periods of economic distress. It's quite another to be permanently thrust out of the job market with no prospects for employment in sight. And just to put a footnote here, think about this. It's an unprecedented moment in American history because African Americans, from the very beginning of American history, have always had a place, a central place in the economy. So to be kicked out, literally lots of people, decade by decade, are being kicked out of the economy. That was really quite unprecedented. Deindustrialization in the 1960s and 70s added further insult to injury, ratcheting up racial and class inequities even further. And the economic constraints have also been exacerbated by cultural changes, such as the growth of women's employment outside of the home and advances in education. These and other cultural factors have contributed to the overall decline of rates of marriage. So for all racial groups, there's a kind of a downward slope of marriage over the course of the 20th century, since the mid-20th century. And that's not just true in the United States, that's true in most Western industrialized countries. But the trends have been most dramatic and most destructive to African Americans. These negative repercussions may seem ironic or contrary to the achievements of the civil rights movement. The movement generated other important milestones in the history of racial justice and heightened expectations that black achievements in many arenas could be overcome, or could overcome, sort of the racial injustices of the past. But whatever progress it engendered, it could not and did not reverse the pattern of racial disparity in marriage rates at mid-century or since. While civil rights victories enabled the growth of the black middle class, they did more to secure voting rights, desegregation of public accommodations, and expand opportunities for participating in electoral politics. Economic gains among some African Americans were made in the transition from agricultural and domestic work to industrial jobs. The strongest gains occurred in the public sector, which were fragile and subjected to shifts over the next several decades. But this process existed alongside a deep well of chronic, permanent unemployment that continued to grow for a significant segment of the most vulnerable, particularly as they moved from the South from the rural South especially, to the industrial North in the era of the World Wars. The fact that there has been progress is also used to blame the decline in marital rates and nuclear families on individuals, sort of seeing individuals as being responsible for what's considered to be moral dysfunction. This downplays and or ignores the role that economic factors and racism have played in driving these rates down. Economic distress has been compounded by and linked to other factors. Heterosexual marriage making requires relatively even numbers of men and women in the population, but unusual demographic shifts have occurred in the late 20th century that have threatened the potential for mating. So you have high mortality rates caused by homicides, heart and respiratory diseases, especially among Black men. That has really helped to lower the numbers of marriageable men in the pool of sort of people seeking to mate and marry. In addition, a new variation on an old theme of disfranchisement and unjust imprisonment emerged as the war on drugs and mandatory prison laws have led to mass incarceration, especially since the 1970s and 1980s, despite the decline in violent crime. So more people are going to prison, even though crime is coming down. More African Americans are under the supervision of the criminal justice system today, that is probation, parole, jail, or prison, than were enslaved in 1850. This has pushed down marriage rates even further by depriving communities of disproportionate numbers of men in their prime years. Men and growing numbers of women are barred by laws and discriminatory practices from participating in mainstream economic and political activities that make sustaining marriages and families while imprisoned and forming them once released difficult at best. It is an undeniable fact that by the 1990s, African American marriage rates were the opposite of where they began in 1900. By the last decade of the 20th century, most Blacks over 18 years old, about 40%, were unmarried, whereas the reverse was still true for white Americans, most of whom, 72%, were married. Although some policymakers, political pundits, even some scholars wrongly argue that recent patterns of Black marriage are the product of slavery, they tend to ignore or minimize the impact of things that have happened, all the social and economic conditions and things that have happened to shape family formation in the intervening years, long after slavery ended. The close connection between economic inequality and the decline of Black marriage rates have persisted into the 21st century. Just to give you one example, in 2008, 32% of Blacks over the age of 18 were married, compared to 56% of whites. But African Americans have also served as the canaries in the coal mine, projecting warnings of ominous situations that await other populations. So we have arrived at a moment in time when a few are gaining access to all the benefits of citizenship and national belonging, and the many appear to be stalling or falling further behind. We see this in how economic inequality is also eroding the prospects for marriage and family formation for working class and underemployed white Americans. Marriage is now perceived to be a privilege of affluence rather than a strategy for survival that working people were able to rely on in the past. It is often considered to be more of an aspirational goal, as something held in high esteem, but just out of reach by people struggling economically. Marriage is now seen as something you do after you have established your material foundation in life. And this is further complicated by the fact that many people now have much higher expectations than previous generations of what a spouse should be. Not just an equal partner, but perfect soulmate. And yet, we've also arrived at a historic moment when marriage equality is now available to all, regardless of sexual orientation, thanks to the United States Supreme Court ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015. Still, it is worth remembering that marriage has always been a privilege, not even accessible to all straight people. Groups that have been historically deprived of equal marriage rights discover, upon achieving them, that they need to be supported by economic and social equality in order to truly afford the dignity and the choice intended. Once they gain these rights, it becomes more difficult to reject them without incurring disrespect and even anger, further marginalizing unique domestic arrangements that refuse to be or are unable to be corralled under the terms of legal marriage. And marriage equality, of course, is not without its ironies. Members of the LGBTQ community can now legally wed, yet they are still not fully guaranteed many other basic civil rights that protect against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The achievement of marriage equality, whether in the 19th century for African Americans or in the current day for everyone, may not ultimately be what we have bargained for until and unless our society is committed to providing the commensurate institutional supports that allow people to marry, to form healthy, safe, and functioning families of their choosing in a context in which true equality and justice prevail. So my great-great-grandparents traveled a long way compared to the people before them, yet their descendants have had their share of struggles too, even with increasing marriage rights. So it's up to all of us as a society to decide how will we shape the future generations to come. I'll end there.